Her water broke at 10:47 p.m. On a Wednesday, on the concrete floor of the admissions corridor at Corlebu Teaching Hospital in Accra, and the woman behind the counter did not look up. Nkechi Okafor was 31 years old, 108 pounds, and she had eaten half a piece of bread at noon because the other half was wrapped in a cloth in her bag for the morning. She was wearing a yellow cotton dress with small white flowers along the hem. She had bought it 3 months ago at Mokola Market for 12 cedis because it was the only dress she owned that still buttoned across her belly. The dress was clean. She had washed it by hand the night before in a blue plastic basin, pressed it flat with the warmth of her palms because she had no iron, and folded it the way her mother had taught her, lengthwise twice, then in thirds, as if the cloth were something precious. She had taken 2 buses to get here. The first had left her on the Tema motorway with a torn transfer slip, and she had stood in the dark for 23 minutes waiting for the second. Her feet were bare inside rubber sandals, and the night air in October carried a chill that came up from the pavement in waves. She had walked the last 4 blocks because the second bus stopped 1 street early, and the driver would not wait. In her bag, a brown leather bag that had belonged to her mother, stitched by hand in Enugu in 1989, with a small brass clasp that no longer clicked shut. She had 340 cedis. She had counted it 4 times on the bus. 340 cedis, and a card from the antenatal clinic at Labadi that said her name, her blood type, her due date, and the name of the midwife who had seen her twice. She had been bleeding lightly since 7 that evening. Not heavily, just enough that she had folded a towel and held it against herself on the bus and watched the other passengers and said nothing. Her name was Nkechi Okafor. She was 9 months pregnant, and she was standing at the admissions counter of a hospital that smelled of floor disinfectant and the distant, dry edge of something antiseptic and institutional, and the woman behind the counter still had not looked up. The woman's name tag said Grace. She was wearing green scrubs and small gold earrings, and she had a sheet of paper in front of her she was filling out with a blue pen that she kept clicking against the clipboard between entries. There was a fluorescent strip above her desk that buzzed faintly every few seconds. A long steady hum, and then a brief silence, and then the hum again. Grace had stopped hearing it. She had stopped hearing a lot of things. Nkechi said, "Please, I need help. The baby is coming early." Grace looked up. She looked at the yellow dress first, then the plastic sandals, then the brown leather bag with the broken clasp. Then she looked at Nkechi's face, and the calculation behind her eyes was so familiar, so practiced, that it happened in less than 2 seconds. "Delivery sweet deposit," Grace said. "Is cash payment or card?" "I have 340 cedis," Nkechi said. "I have my clinic card. I have been coming for antenatal. Delivery sweet deposit is 1,200 cedis. If you don't have it, you go to the public queue in Building C. There is a 4-hour wait on the public queue tonight. You register, you sit, you wait." Nkechi said she was bleeding. She said quietly and without drama, the way a person says a fact they have been managing alone for 3 hours and have now simply chosen to share, "I have been bleeding since 7 o'clock. It is not a lot, but it started before it should. I am 9 months, and the clinic card says my due date." Grace had already looked back down at her clipboard. A man in a white coat passed behind the counter. He was a doctor, Dr. Mensah, his name tag said. Though from the angle Nkechi stood, she could only read the first initial. He had a phone pressed against his ear, and he was speaking in a low, quick voice, and he looked at Nkechi exactly once and looked away. "Doctor," she said. Not loudly. Clearly, he did not stop walking. There was a security guard leaning against the wall near the door, a young man with a torch on his belt and boots that had a crack across the left toe. He had been watching Nkechi since she walked in, not with hostility, with the practiced distance of someone who had learned that watching was the only thing required of him in situations like this. 2 other women sat on the hard plastic chairs against the wall. One was asleep. The other was looking at her phone. Nkechi stood at the counter for another 6 minutes. She explained again about the bleeding. She explained that she had been to antenatal twice, that she had her card, that she was due in 4 days. Grace told her that the process was the same for everyone, and that Building C was through the corridor and left, and that the sign was clearly marked. She turned away from the counter. She did not drop the bag. She pressed it once against her side, fingers closing around the strap, and she turned and began to walk toward the corridor that led to Building C. Outside the glass entrance doors, a black Mercedes had just pulled into the hospital car park. It had been there for perhaps 4 minutes, engine running, before a man got out. He was wearing a white kaftan and plain leather sandals, and he was neither tall nor short. He was the kind of man whose physical presence was unremarkable right up until the moment people noticed it. He was 58 years old. He walked with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had not been in a hurry in a very long time. His name was Chief Emmanuel Owusu Boateng, and he had come tonight because his cardiologist had called him at 9 p.m. to review test results that could wait until morning, but that Emmanuel had decided should not. He had almost reached the entrance doors when he saw a pregnant woman in a yellow dress turn away from the admissions counter and begin walking slowly down a corridor, one hand on her lower back, one hand holding a brown bag to her side. He saw Grace behind the counter, still filling out the form. He walked through the entrance. He stopped at the counter. He placed both hands flat on the surface, and he looked at Grace and he said, "The woman who just walked away." What did she need? Grace looked up. She looked at him once, the kaftan, the leather sandals, the stillness, and something in her expression shifted by a fraction that was too small to name. "Sir." She did not have the delivery suite deposit. I directed her to Building. Which way? Grace pointed down the corridor. Emmanuel walked down the corridor. He walked at the same pace he always walked. He found Nkechi 20 meters from the Building C entrance, standing against the wall with one hand pressed flat against the painted concrete, breathing in a way that was controlled and careful and cost her something. He stopped beside her. He did not touch her. He said, "You are Nkechi Okafor." She turned and looked at him. "How do you know my name?" she said. He said, "Your mother was Adeze Okafor. She sewed bags in Enugu. She sold them at Onitsha Main Market from 1987 until 2002. She was looking at him. The hand on the wall had not moved. She made a bag, he said, with a brass clasp and a stitched handle. I bought one from her in 1994. It was for my wife's birthday. Nkechi did not speak. If this story is already reaching somewhere in you that you weren't prepared for, stay with me, because what happens in the next few minutes is something no one in that corridor was ready for. My wife, Emmanuel said, kept that bag for 11 years. She used it every day. She said it was the best-made bag she had ever owned. He paused. She passed in 2005. I still have the bag. It is exactly like that one. He looked at the brown leather bag against Nkechi's side. Exactly. There are moments in a life when a string of separate events that seem to have nothing to do with each other turns out to have been pulling in the same direction the whole time. Nkechi's mother had died in 2011 and had left her the bag and 3 other things: a Bible with the corners folded, a letter she could not finish reading until the 2nd year, and a recipe for groundnut soup that she made now every Saturday, because it was the only Saturday ritual she had that still felt like being held. She did not know until this moment that one of her mother's bags had lived in a house in Accra for 30 years and had outlasted the woman who carried it. She said nothing. She just stood there with her hand on the wall and water running down the inside of her dress, and a pain that had moved from dull to something more specific in the last 3 minutes. Emmanuel turned back toward the admissions hall. He walked at the same pace. He stopped at the counter. He placed a single black card on the surface in front of Grace and said, "Admit that woman now. Full private suite. Whatever she needs tonight." Grace picked up the card with both hands. He said, "And please call Dr. Asante. If she is not on duty, tell her Emmanuel called." Within 4 minutes, Nkechi Okafor was in a bed in the private maternity wing on the 2nd floor. The room had curtains the color of pale yellow, not bright yellow, but the yellow of early morning before the sun has fully committed, and a window that faced the hospital garden, and a monitoring machine that hummed quietly and was not fluorescent and did not flicker. A midwife named Sister Patience, who had been at Corlebu for 22 years and had delivered 3,400 babies, and who smelled faintly of lavender fabric softener, came in and took Nkechi's hand and said, "I'm here." And that was all she said, and it was enough. Dr. Asante arrived at 11:22 p.m. She was 49 years old and had trained in London and come back and had opinions about a great many things and no patience for nonsense. And she reviewed the bleeding and the monitoring results and said it was early but manageable and that they would proceed carefully and that Nkechi had done the right thing coming when she did. At 2:09 a.m. on Thursday morning, a girl was born. She weighed 8 kilograms and was pink and loud, and did not stop being loud for several minutes, which Sister Patience said was the best possible sign. Nkechi held her, and the baby's face was so small it fit in the palm of one hand, and Nkechi pressed her lips against the top of her head and closed her eyes. In the private waiting room at the end of the hall, Emmanuel Owusu Boateng sat in a chair with a cup of tea he had been given 40 minutes ago and had not drunk. He was not a relative. He had no reason to stay. He stayed. He was not a man who talked about what he had. He was a man who had built 3 logistics companies across West Africa over 34 years, who had 1,200 people on his payroll, who had a foundation in his late wife's name that had sent 400 girls to secondary school. None of this was in the kaftan or the sandals. All of it was in the stillness. People who encountered him often described feeling, afterward, that they had been in the presence of someone who had already solved the problem and was simply waiting for the right moment to show the solution. His wife's name had been Afia. She had died of a condition that, if caught 6 months earlier, might not have killed her. She had been turned away from a hospital once for a reason Emmanuel had never forgotten and had never spoken about publicly. He had thought about it every day for 20 years. He had done what he could with that thought. In the morning, when Nkechi was awake and the baby was asleep against her chest, Emmanuel came to the doorway and knocked once. She looked at him. He said, "Your mother's name is on a bursary at the foundation I run. It has been there since 2006. There are 14 girls currently on that bursary studying in Accra and Kumasi." He paused. "I named it after her because I thought it was the least I could do for something she built that outlasted everything else in my house." Nkechi looked at him for a long time. She said, "She never told me." "I know," he said. "I asked her not to. I thought she might find it embarrassing. I understand now that was the wrong assumption." He looked at the baby. "What will you call her?" he said. Nkechi looked down. The baby's hands were curled against her chest, fingers no larger than a child's smallest beads. Adese, she said. After my mother. Emmanuel looked at the bag on the bedside table. The brown leather. The broken brass clasp. He was quiet for a moment. The way a person is quiet when they are looking at a thing they have not seen in a very long time and are trying to decide whether it is the same. He said, "I can have that clasp repaired if you would like. There is a craftsman in Osu who worked with leather for 40 years. He does not see well anymore, but his hands remember what to do." Nkechi said yes. The clasp was repaired 10 days later. The craftsman's name was old Mr. Asante, no relation to the doctor, and he worked at a small bench on Osu Oxford Street with a lamp pulled low and hands that moved slowly and without hesitation. He charged 25 cedis, and he would not accept more. The bag came back, with the clasp clicking shut the way it was supposed to, the way it must have clicked for Afia Owusu Boateng on her birthday in 1994. In a home in cantonments where someone who loved her had chosen this particular thing because it was well made and because it would last. Nkechi carried it back to the clinic for Adese's 2-week check. She carried it to the market. She carried it on the bus. It clicked when she closed it, and the sound was small, indefinite, and it meant something she did not have the exact words for, but did not need words for. Because some things are carried rather than spoken. Grace, the admissions clerk, was called to a review meeting 11 days after that night. The meeting was attended by the hospital's patient relations officer, the head of maternity services, and a representative from the Ministry of Health who had received, by that point, 3 separate formal complaints about triage procedures at that admissions desk over a period of 4 months. The meeting lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, new intake protocols were introduced for all high-risk obstetric presentations regardless of payment status, and a training program was scheduled for admissions staff across 4 facilities in the Greater Accra region. The first session was held at Korle-Bu, in the room where Nkechi had stood counting the distance between herself and Building C. Dr. Mensah, who had passed without stopping, was not present at the first training session. He had transferred to a private clinic in East Legon by then. He was a competent doctor. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had learned that looking away was easier than deciding, and no one had ever required anything different of him until now. Grace attended every session. She asked more questions than anyone else in the room. There are things that look like an ending that are in fact the hinge. A door closing in someone's face. A counter turned away from. A corridor walked alone at 11 p.m., with water running into rubber sandals. What the people who close the doors and turn away and watch without moving do not understand, what they cannot know until long after it is too late to matter, is that the person they sent away carries something in their hands that the building they are standing in was never equipped to hold. Nkechi Okafor had carried her mother's bag across a city in the dark. She had counted 340 cedis 4 times and stood at a counter in a yellow dress that she had washed by hand, and it had not been enough, and she had turned and walked down a corridor and stood against a wall. And none of that is the story. The story is that her mother had once sat in a market in Onitsha with leather and thread and made something so carefully that it was still whole 35 years later, and that this careful making had traveled through hands and years and a city and found its way back to the daughter who did not know it had ever left. You cannot take what a person carries. Not truly. You can close a door on it. You can tell it to go to Building C. You can look at the dress before the face and calculate accordingly. But what is made with real care, what is carried rather than worn, kept rather than shown, passed rather than sold, does not disappear because someone turns away from it. It waits. It finds its way. It clicks shut in the right hands at the right time. The people who think they are sending others away are sometimes, without knowing it, sending them straight toward the thing that was waiting for them. The people who overlook you at the counter are occasionally the last people who will ever have that particular power over you. And sometimes the door that closes the hardest is the one that was never yours to begin with. Adeze Okafor took her first steps on a Tuesday morning at 11 months old, in a house on a street in Labadi, in the direction of the brown leather bag sitting against the wall. Her mother watched. The clasp clicked. Leave your answer in the comments. I want to hear it. If someone turned you away on the worst night of your life, and later, without looking for it, you found out that what they rejected was exactly what the world was waiting for, would you go back and let them see it? Or would you walk forward and never look behind you again? I really want to read what you think. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.